So I like have just very, very little insight into like the early church fathers.
Yeah,
And I was sharing with you like growing up, like I fell in love early on with like people like Luther and Calvin and Charles Hodge and Spurgeon, and a lot of them came from kind of like that Reformed kind of tradition.
hmm,
And so that led me into like a Presbyterian Reformed church where
hmm,
I learned a lot, and the pastors were very much like study Burkhoff and study these systematics and the
yeah,
Westminster Confession of Faith. So you kind of know my kind of path,
yeah,
and as I've like kind of been exploring different traditions, like I've just been falling in love with like just different ways that different traditions are looking at scripture,
hmm,
and also Paul specifically, because Paul like really did so much as far as Christian theology is concerned, as far
yeah,
as like doctrine of original sin, justification. And so when I was going through looking at upcoming books on Amazon, I saw your book, and then I started to research. I was like, oh my gosh, you've been like focused on Paul and this idea of like works of the law for like I think at least 9 years. Is that right?
it's been a while. It's been a while.
So I want to ask you like what got you started? Because that's a huge chunk of your life devoted to Paul
Yeah,
and specifically works of the law.
yeah,
And can you share us a little bit about your journey, like what led you to that point?
yeah. No, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. So, it's interesting. There's probably a lot of parallels in our background as well. And it's interesting if you trace this all the way back, you can trace this all the way back to really when I was, in middle school and high school, and really wrestling with a lot of kind of what I was taught in church and just trying to figure out, hey, how do I make sense of what I've been given here, because I wasn't from a Christian background or originally, and the faith had a really big impact in my life. But I think the way that the sort of faith works paradigm was presented to me, so being justified by faith apart from works of the law, the way that was sort of if I was to give like a summary statement, the way that was presented is you go to heaven when you die. So that's sort of what justified means, because you believe this thing, so that's faith, and not because of not because of anything else that's around, so anything you do. And I mean, I guess I want to say before anything else, I mean, I still think there's some truth to that, in the sense that we it's not like God goes and receives us into relationship with him because we have some sort of pre-existing achievements or something like that. We arrive precisely as beggars, to his
Mm,
mercy. And so there's something I could tell that was really right in that. And then I think what I found difficult was trying to figure out how you could go and map that paradigm onto the rest of Scripture. And so, kind of kind of put on the shelf reconciling that paradigm with the Old Testament, or reconciling that paradigm with, Jesus or the other, epistles like James or whatever. Even just when I was looking at Paul's writings and saying, okay, how do I fit this onto Paul's writings? I really struggled with that, because it seemed like there's a lot of things that Paul was saying that seemed like it's almost like he presupposed that the congregations that he was dealing with, that there's kind of a moral framework that they had to adhere to, and if they didn't adhere to it, they were toast, they're out the door. And so I was just trying to think, how does all these pieces fit together? And for me, it really actually it caused quite a bit of difficulty. And I think,
mm,
I got to the point where I was just basically like, I don't know if I can really believe this stuff anymore. So I kind of, for all intents and purposes, just stopped practicing the faith for a while, because even though I couldn't walk away from it entirely, because I had seen the effects in my life, I had no real clear way of making sense of this dichotomy. And then it also sort of left open the door. It's like, well, hey, if you prayed this prayer, you believe this thing, you're good regardless. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm good regardless. So whether this is true or this is false, I guess it's not really going to change for me, because I prayed the prayer and I did the thing. So, and now, and it's interesting. It's easy to kind of look at that and say, uh, boy, that's not fantastic theology. That might be some kind of broader theological truth, reduced to some to some caricature. But that was genuinely the ideas that I was engaging with. That was really what was live there. And so, um, as I went on, there was I mean, gosh, there's just too much in the faith, and that I couldn't deny, and too much that God had done in my own life that I couldn't deny. And so long story short, I ended up going into doing to ministry work after I went to Pepperdine University, and I was working at an inner city ministry in Oakland called Harbor House Ministries. I was running an after school program for kids there, which is great. And still, I mean, just some of the people in the world we're closest with. It's a fantastic ministry. And I had gotten into N.T. Wright's work and had heard he'd given this class called Romans in a Week at the Regent College. This is, I think, back in the 90s, maybe.
Oh, wow.
And it's one of the I think it's probably their most downloaded course they have over the decades. It's a really popular course. So I had come across this, and I heard this is a section he's talking about the word faith, and he says, yeah, translators aren't really sure what to do in this particular instance because the word for faith, sopistis, is also the same word for faithfulness. And so we don't really know, do you translate this, faith of Christ or faithfulness of Christ or faith in Christ or, et cetera. And I remember I was driving a car at the time. I was driving to work, and like I almost needed to pull over and just sort of like take very deep breaths, because I was just thinking like as I was listening to this,
Yeah.
all the theological paradigms that I had sort of inherited as a kid that I couldn't quite figure out, they just sort of all like turned to dust all at once. It was like, wait a second. If faith and faithfulness are the same word, then this can't be, Paul can't be giving this sort of strict kind of belief versus obedience or action category, because both of those terms are on the same side of this dichotomy that he's setting up. And so you can't be justified, by faithfulness and not faithfulness. It doesn't make any sense. And so if Paul then meant something, you could say, something more fully orbed when he said, when he used the word pistis. If he means something more than just kind of, belief in a cognitive kind of sense. And it includes our response, and includes the response of fidelity and, loyalty to God. Then what's he reacting against? What's that other term that's there? And how does this whole dichotomy, actually work? What's the actual conflict that Paul's engaged in? And so that then led me to saying, okay, well, what's the other term? How do we make sense of that? And then from there, it was looking in the old and new perspectives on Paul and seeing, what Wright said about that versus what people like Luther and Calvin said about that. And then finally, going and starting to look at what does the early church say about this, and how does this kind of relate to our contemporary debates and everything.
That's fantastic. And I feel like going back to that challenge of early in your life as you were kind of exposed to one form of Christianity, and then going through that season of like doubting, like, what does this really mean? And that place where you got, and I think a lot of us get there when you start to take the Bible seriously, or you start to study, where you start to feel like, what does this really mean to me? Is this true? You start having all these questions, and the more serious you take the Bible, sometimes the more questions you'd have, right? It doesn't make things easier by studying the Bible, because things get more complicated, and then there's more viewpoints that you start getting exposed to. How did you kind of come to terms with that kind of doubting period, and then moving forward to like go to Pepperdine, and then like take your faith really seriously to actually go to seminary and like pursue biblical studies?
Yeah, boy, that's a fantastic question, Mike. I think for me, I think even though there was questions that I had unanswered, I think coming into contact with real evil, and then being reminded by contact with real evil of the reality of of real goodness and God's own goodness, and having experienced that in my life, and seeing the way that God had shared his own goodness with me, and going and shaping me in a way that was different from the background and the way that I grew up and stuff. I think for me, I kind of got to a point where I'm like, Lord, I don't have all the answers to these questions, but I know that you're worthy. I know that you are more worthy than anything else I've come across. And I know that, this faith that you've given me, there's nothing of greater worth than I've experienced. And so for me, it was coming to that realization and having confidence in the truth, just, that, if God is the author of all truth, that, that the truth will be vindicated in some kind of way. And God will show himself to be vindicated, even if I can't see the way that that's going to work out, right now. And so, for me, that was kind of going to Pepperdine. I'd never gone to a Christian school before. And so for me, it was actually, I kind of come from the opposite of a sheltered background. And so for me, I was quite refreshing going to a place,
Mm.
where, you had a place where the kind of the life of the mind and also the life of, faith were integrated in the way they are there. For me, it was a really, really beneficial place. And then honestly, as far as ministry stuff, kind of any kind of scholarship things like that, that wasn't sort of my my life plan. I didn't. If anything, growing up, I was kind of the more kind of skeptical, cynical kid, and I think as you allude to some of that, it was just like taking it seriously, asking hard questions there, and then not always really getting like serious answers to those questions. So, I was political science and international studies when I was
Mm.
undergraduate. I wasn't a theology guy or anything like that. And this is just before my senior year. I experienced a pretty dramatic call to ministry. And I'd started volunteering at that place, Harbor House. And I mean, that's kind of the only way I can say it, is there was a sort of a personal experience that repeated itself where I could sense that God was wanting me to go towards ministry stuff. And so I just tried to say yes to that, and suddenly had a whole bunch of things, open up where people said, "Hey, can you speak for this thing? Can you be the ministry person for this?" And I'm like, "You realize I have zero credentials to do anything, right?" And they're like, "Yeah, that's fine. Just come and do it." So that was how I got started. And then, yeah, it was just kind of, I guess you could say, just sort of walking in faith, where it's like I know that I've seen these things to be true. I think particularly, doing inner city ministry, I think that in some ways that was actually easier for me, because the way that I'd been raised when I was younger, there's a lot of parallels with the kinds of stuff that I was running into with kids that we're working with. And so, even though I didn't have the answer to every theological question, I could look at their lives and I could look at my life when I was their age and say, "Hey, God took me and he turned me and brought me to a very different place than where my life should have ended up, if he hadn't gone and done what he had done." And so for me, it made it easy to kind of go and to be able to serve in that kind of context. And then just since then, just the way that we've experienced God's direction and faithfulness, it's been unreal. I never got when I got into that, I was never thinking, hey, so this is going to lead to all that stuff in Paul that you could never figure out. All that suddenly, all that eventually being resolved, and actually, being able to contribute something, kind of to scholarship stuff. I never had any clue any of this was gonna happen.
I love how you explain kind of like how faith impacted you personally, and then you like leading you to do ministry and outreach and helping the youth, and then like God using that critical, skeptical mind that you had to like
Mm.
apply it to like things like works of the law and like
Yeah,
Paul's words, and like taking your questioning and like going deep, like let's go deep on this. And I just love that, like in your search, like you're like, let's take a look at the early church. Let's see
yeah,
what they said. How did they interpret Paul? Because like talk about how do you get to the authorial intent? You try to get as close as you can to like the readers of the time to get
yeah,
a sense of what was Paul meaning here.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so tell me about like that journey, like as you began to like explore that concept
yeah.
um, of like, okay, justified by faith, and is it faith, faithfulness, and then like, what is that opposed to works of the law? What is works of the law? Walk us through like how you began to like query that.
Yeah. So for me, I had always, from what I knew about the early church, I'd always just held a high view of it without really knowing a whole lot. I think, like a lot of people just kind of bouncing between different, denominations, ecclesial contexts and stuff. I just didn't have a whole lot of real knowledge besides, gosh, these people sound really cool from the little tidbits I've picked up, and I would really love to study them someday. And I already had, kind of a high view to go and start with. And some of that is just, just based off of, if you're thinking in relation to scriptural interpretation, like these are people who share the same context. They're people who are, historically, they're so much closer and have such closer ties than we can ever possibly hope to go and to reconstruct by, the best of methods that we can go and come up with. There's a quote from C.S. Lewis, which you probably come across, that features in the conclusion of the book, from his Fern Seed and Elephants, which just kind of says, the idea that we as sort of modern people can go and reconstruct everything perfectly, and that everybody in, the original context, just, who understood the culture, who understood everything, that they didn't get this. This is like, this idea is so preposterous that I almost don't know how to engage with it. So anyway, I've kind of always had that just as a sense of, when you need to understand what scripture means in one way or another, that you kind of have that as a, as a guide, though it wasn't something that originally I'd gone and tested a whole lot of. I really got into, when I started at Regent College, I had a chance to start reading through the early church fathers, and was just blown away. The richness that was there, I just found to be unbelievable. And so that was already happening as that was kind of going on at the same time as I was doing this work on justification. So, some papers I was writing on justification and stuff, and then particularly this paper on works of the law, which became sort of the seed article, which then became the dissertation, which then became the book in the first version, and now in the new versions coming out with IVP. That paper, I wrote, or you can say the genesis of that paper is I was just doing an assessment of the old and new perspectives on works of the law, because the longer I studied, it kind of seemed like this is really your key issue that divides them. There's a lot of other stuff that they're more or less on the same page, or at least kind of in the same ballpark. And when it comes to works of the law, they weren't in the same ballpark. They weren't even playing the same sport. It's totally different. And so that was what I was trying to reconcile. And I was just trying to, write a paper to reconcile on a pure kind of exegetical basis. But I was reading John Calvin's commentary on the Romans. And I was just in the Regent Library looking through it. And I had read a lot of Calvin the semester previously for J.I. Packer. So I've gotten really used to the way that he goes and writes, and just rhetorically the way that he goes and operates. And so I got to the section I was looking at in Romans 3:20, and he says, "It is a matter of doubt even amongst the learned what the works of the law mean." And then he goes, which I thought, well, that's a really interesting admission. And then he goes and he says, the addition of law induced, Chrysostom, Origen, Jerome to think this is referring to, the ceremonies of the Mosaic law. And then he goes and he proceeds to say, I'm aware that St. Augustine has a different position from what I'm saying too. And then he kind of says, hey, all these guys are wrong. And then he sort of goes and proceeds. And I'm just thinking, like, this is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because Calvin really, I don't know if you had a chance to read, a lot of Calvin, he loves bringing the church fathers with him. He loves, specifically Augustine, but Chrysostom, any of these guys, he loves to go in any disputed matter. He always goes and brings them along. He says, well, Chrysostom agrees with me here, or, I'm saying the same thing that, Augustine says. And so that's just a commonplace across his writings, and especially when there's a lot at stake. And here I'm looking at this and thinking, like, this seems like this is the place where everything is at stake.
Right, right.
Not like every single thing in the whole universe, but as I'm going through his debate, like, wow, it seems like this is your kind of key hinge thing. And he doesn't cite anybody who has the position that he has. And I thought, this is really odd. I was just standing there looking. I wonder if you looked in the early church and you looked at what they thought about works of the law. I wonder how they interpreted this. And I wonder, if you looked and said, I wonder how that would actually relate to what we're calling the old and new perspectives on Paul, because here is, Calvin, who, we're thinking is this old perspective guy. But when he's looking at the really old interpreters, he's saying they're all wrong. And
Mm.
he doesn't cite anybody that he says is right. He says they're all wrong, and that's just, it's uncharacteristic for him. So that was the big surprise, was going and looking in these early interpreters and finding that so much of what they say sounds similar to folks like N.T. Wright and what we call the new perspective on Paul. So we have this funny debate where we're calling one side the new perspective, the other side the old perspective, and the whole thing is kind of standing on its head. So anyways, that's some of how I first got into this. So it was a credit to Calvin, and a credit to Dr. Packer for having us read lots of him.
Well, and I love, like, again, like your critical mind. Like, you read that, and a lot of us might just skip over, like, okay, Calvin didn't know, he just moving on. But you're like, oh no, actually this is interesting, and you're like digging in,
Yeah,
going, wow, Calvin's like going against like the church fathers who he quotes all the time, like
yeah,
Augustine. Like, he loves Augustine. He's always like referring back to Augustine, and now he's like
yeah,
challenging Augustine's thoughts here,
yeah,
and kind of going alone, which is like dangerous territory for any of us when we kind of
yeah,
go alone. Because what if we're wrong, especially on a
yeah,
pivotal point like works of law versus faith, like what's actually being meant here. That's always the I don't know, the dangerous territory that I feel like I get into sometimes, especially as
mm,
like Protestant. Like, I'm like reading the Bible by myself. I
yeah,
have commentaries that I'm referring to in study Bibles,
yeah,
but I feel like many times like I'm like, what if I'm getting this wrong, right? What if
yeah,
I'm getting this wrong? Because I'm like, I'm reading it for myself and I'm
yeah,
referring to, and we get into trouble too, like if we're all reading different commentaries, different Bible study tools that maybe contradict each other. Like,
totally.
that's right. That leads to a lot of
Totally.
trouble.
No, so I mean, what you're saying is really, I think is really important. And for me, what I recognized was that I think I recognized that when it came to sort of questions of authority, that I already implicitly recognized the authority of the early church. Because when it came to the texts themselves and the transmission of the text, so, which books are constitute inspired scripture among the variety of books that you're going to find that are that you're going to find within the history of early Christianity. Which of these go and constitute inspired scripture, and then the sort of the reliability of transmitting these texts faithfully through the centuries. I recognize that on both of those grounds, I already said, yeah, the early church's authority is the authority. Not that there's some sort of independent authority, but I just implicitly think that God has gone and given them the authority to go and to do this, so that if, I guess you could say, kind of following Luther, if somebody wants to go and toss the book of James out and say, hey, this isn't by the apostles, like, no, I don't think that you can go and do that, because I think that there is, sort of that consensus of the early church. Just thinking to myself, like, if God wasn't guiding the church of the martyrs, like, who would his promises of guidance apply to? Because I know that I'm not a martyr. Like, I haven't done anything, in the realm of being as cool as Ignatius of Antioch, or any Justin Martyr himself, or any figure like this. So if you don't have sort of an implicit level of trust in God's guidance of the early church, then to whom will the promises that Christ goes and makes, as far as the Holy Spirit leading you into all truth, who would that apply to? So for me, that was always like, if you were to deny um, there being a kind of authority with the early church like that, then it always seemed to me like the whole project of Christianity would sort of like kind of crumble. Like, it doesn't. You could then just sort of do pretty much anything and interpret things any which way. And so at the very least, that seemed like that was like the most solid foundation I could come across. And then building on that is just thinking, if I'm reliant on them for the texts themselves, then it's at least reasonable to think that they might know something about what the texts mean. That doesn't seem like it's a stretch. That if by God's mercy He's gone and preserved these texts and transmitted these texts through the agency of the early church, then it makes sense to go and to look and say, if we're trying to figure out what do these texts mean, why don't I go and ask them? That seems reasonable. And it's funny, there's another line in the book that kind of starts the third section, which is the lengthy section that looks at the early interpretation of the works of the law, where Irenaeus just goes and says the same thing, where he says, hey, if there is to arise some dispute on some important question with regard to the faith, how would you go and solve this? And so he's writing about 180 AD, and he says, well, it seems obvious. You would just go and ask the churches, that held kind of constant discourse going all the way back to the time of the apostles, because they knew this stuff. They knew this personally. So anyway, that's some of how I got into all of that.
And I like that you mentioned kind of the old versus new perspectives on Paul, especially in relationship to the works of the law. And I actually never really, I guess I've been out of the loop, because I kind of was just I guess raised with, like I mentioned, kind of the Reformed tradition. So that, I guess that would be the old kind of view of perspective of Paul.
Yeah.
But also, like, I love N.T. Wright. And so, like, I never really heard the term, like, new perspective on Paul until recently. So can you kind of, like, share a little bit about, like, old versus new in relationship to works of the law, just to kind of give, like, categories? Like, I don't really know too much about the old versus new. And is there a third?
Yeah. Gosh, that's a good question. Well, so part of the difficulty is that when you really go and spend a lot of time with the primary sources, you'll find that especially when it comes to the way that they think Paul is reasoning, that even among the old and new perspectives, you're going to find a lot of difference between just within those categories. And so that for me, seeing how different Luther and Calvin, how different they understood Paul's logic. That to me was really fascinating when I had a chance to just spend a lot of time, reading them and why they think Paul is rejecting works of the law. And then similarly, with the new perspective, with Sanders and Dunn and Wright, so the main figures that I go and engage with in the book, even if they agree on the matter, that as far as what are the works of the law, what does practicing them signify, they all have quite different reasoning for why they think Paul is rejecting these. And so they end up just sort of like kind of all over the place as well. And so there's enough coherence to be able to go and to still use these categories and still talk about old perspective, new perspective. But really, when you spend a lot of time with the primary sources, you recognize that it's not uniform. And even figures like you might think like Luther and Calvin, they would be more or less uniform. It's really, really interesting to see how different their reasoning actually goes and runs. I think it's fascinating. It makes for some really, really interesting reading. When it comes to the question of what are we talking when we talk about works of the law, Luther and Calvin, and then the sort of the kind of Lutheran and Reformed traditions that follow from them, they tend to interpret works of the law as anything that one can go and do to earn salvation, and so to be justified before God. And it's usually interpreted at an individual level. And so the significance of doing these is you're trying to earn merit to be saved before God. So you yourself. So there's kind of anything that you can sort of, it's kind of a catch-all category. Interestingly, it goes and includes both works done apart from God's grace and those that are empowered by God's grace, also. And that's not directly relevant to the early perspective stuff. But when you get to the theology of St. Augustine, that's when that sort of distinction is there, because they're sort of distinguishing themselves and their interpretation from Augustine's interpretation there. If you are to look at the new perspective and say, what do they understand by works of the law? Those figures are going to say, when Paul says law, he means a specific law. He's talking about the Torah. He always means the Torah. And so the question is, do you have to go and continue to obey the Mosaic law within the new covenant? And within that law, there's certain works that always go and come up in his letters. And if you're looking within, kind of early context, they always seem to come up as well. So things like circumcision, Sabbath, food laws, the various kind of calendar observances, things like that. So those figures we call the new perspective. So Sanders, Dunn, Wright, people like that. They identify this and say, these are the works of the law that Paul is talking about. And when you're practicing these things, you are not going and trying to earn merit on an individual level. So you're not trying to say, how many points do I get for circumcision? Like, because I need 10 points to be saved. Circumcision is 6 points. Observing the Sabbath is 3 points. Now I just got to do a couple other works to get up to the threshold, and then I'm good. It doesn't carry an individual significance like that. It carries a communal significance. So when you're circumcised, it's not like there's some sort of merit sticker with points attached to it. What happens is you become part of the Jewish nation. You become part of the Jewish covenant. And similarly with this, Sabbath keeping, food laws, you're part of the Jewish nation when you go and you do these things. And so it has a communal rather than an individual significance. And the way that the logic runs is that, why is that significant? Well, because the Jews are the people of God. And so if you are, the idea is that salvation is thought of as, being tied in with, with the Jewish people. So all these Gentiles are flocking in now. That's great. But the Jews are God's people. And we still have the Mosaic covenant, and they kind of have to be grafted into the Mosaic covenant and, the nation that kind of the Mosaic covenant gives rise to. And so because of that, they need to go into, get circumcised, obey the Sabbath and, the food laws and all the things that go and make you a Jew and separated from all the rest of the nations. And so within that new perspective, to understand, Paul's reason is basically say, like, no, that's not the case, because God is the God of all people. And so if you think of, Romans 3, 27, 28, 29, for we reckon that a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law, or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not also the God of the Gentiles? Yes, he is God of the Gentiles, for there's one God who justifies, the faith, justifies the uncircumcised by faith and the circumcised by faith. So it kind of goes on from there. So they look at that and say that's the key issue. It's the Jew-Gentile question. And the question is, do Gentiles within the period of the New Covenant have to become Jews in order to actually go and receive God's grace? And that's what Paul is reacting against and rejecting works of the law. So that's some of what's going on with this particular debate.
Interesting. And you mentioned that Luther Calvin differed from Augustine. So is there a third point of view? I mean, obviously you're saying there's lots of other points of view within these perspectives.
Yeah. So I've had a chance to spend a lot of time with Augustine on this question, which is really enjoyable. And you'll see, there's towards the end of the book, there's a very lengthy Augustine footnote on this, and the way that he goes and he uses what I call the early perspective tradition, the way that he appropriates that, and then in a sense goes and transposes that in the context of the Pelagian controversy. So Pelagius, he's arguing back and forth about the nature of salvation, everything like that. And it's interesting because you have a debate which is originally between sort of Jews and Gentiles, or kind of Gentile Christians, or a mixed body of Christians versus Jews on the other side. And so you have that debate, and then when in Augustine's context, it's transposed into a debate about salvation between just Christians. So when he's engaging these texts versus Pelagius, the Jewish question has sort of fallen out of sight, and it's sort of transposed into a new debate. And so the debate with Pelagius becomes, are there? And some of this is hard because with Pelagius, when we're trying to reconstruct his views, it's notoriously difficult because on the one hand, Pelagius doesn't always seem like he is represented in the most fair and accurate way. It's usually most of what we have is preserved by the people who disagreed with him. But then he also seems to be a bit slippery, which is interesting historically how it seems like Augustine is, frustrated by this. He'll be on trial in the East, and they'll go and they'll ask him a question, and he'll be like, oh yeah, I believe that, that's fine, or I'll go and I'll condemn that proposition, and Augustine, way out and like, no, he doesn't actually believe that. What's wrong with you guys? How could you let him off with this way? And so it's really interesting. But it seems as though what it comes down to is that Pelagius wants to go and have the door open for there being works that we can do that justify us apart from God's grace. And that's really what Augustine is wanting to go and shut the door to. He's wanting to go and shut the door to the idea that anything that we do apart from God's grace can be justifying before God. Now, whether we consider that in the sense of meriting forgiveness, or going and God actually making us righteous through these things, kind of table that question as far as what we actually mean about the nature of justification there. Augustine, the thing he's really trying to do there is to close the door on Pelagius, that anything that we do, apart from God's, sanctifying grace in our lives, could go and merit the grace of salvation. And so the way that he looks at this dichotomy is he kind of looks at works of the law as anything done apart from God's grace. And then he goes and he contrasts that, with faith or works of faith. And that's anything that's done that's empowered by God's grace. So then it's interesting for Augustine, you can still have works be justifying, but they have to be works done that are empowered by God's grace, because otherwise they don't. There's no merit there, and there's nothing that we can do apart from His grace to be able to do anything that actually is avails anything before God. It's interesting how. And if this is too much inside baseball for you, feel free to.
This is fantastic. I'm just taking notes here, and I'm separating apart from God's grace versus empowered by God's grace. I'm just having these two categories.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And so the way that he goes and conceives of that, he kind of transposes it into this new context. Now, there's two things to say on this. One is that when it comes to sort of the Augustinian perspective in relation to what you would call the early perspectives, they're still broadly compatible in that it's not like the early perspectives are saying, hey, all these works done apart from God's grace are meritorious. It just locates the particular debate in the context of the Jew-Gentile issue that Paul is talking about in Romans and Galatians. And so it's pretty easy to go and to regard them as compatible, and to understand them as sort of mutually holding together a theological reality. The other thing that you should say that you have to kind of acknowledge is that Augustine himself, he doesn't abandon what we would call the early perspective, because outside the context of this Pelagian controversy, so towards the end of his life, after he's sort of done beating Pelagius with a shovel or whatever, all these disputes. Towards the end of his life, he has this little treatise called An Answer to the Jews. And what's fascinating is that here he continues to go and to say the early perspective stuff that he's said kind of early on in his career when he's outside of the context of the Pelagian controversy. So once the debate is back to a debate between Christians and Jews, he sounds just like these early figures, like Justin Martyr, or Irenaeus, or Ignatius of Antioch, or Origen, and then going forward, it sounds a lot like N.T. Wright as well, and these figures that we're calling the new perspective. And so it's important to go and to see in Augustine's own thought that even where it goes and develops, it doesn't develop in a way that is incompatible with the views that you could say the early interpreters held. It's just he's engaging a new problem, a new issue within the context of the Pelagian controversy. And so it's kind of, so to take Calvin as one example, Calvin sets his position both in distinction to this, what we call the early perspective. So what he identifies with Origen, Chrysostom, Jerome, and both Luther and Calvin, they often say Jerome is, or not sorry, Jerome. They'll often say that Origen is kind of the big guy who goes and gets everything wrong, because in their own historical context, Origen's commentary on Romans is the earliest interpretation of this stuff that they have, and they both tend to look at this and say, we think this is wrong, and so they kind of pin, all the errors on Origen and say, hey, he must have messed things up, which is really interesting because having more access to historical sources now, we can actually look at Origen and say he instead of doing something new, he's actually going and just saying what everybody before him said. So Origen is being a traditionalist rather than an innovator in this area. The second thing is, so that's the early position that Calvin is kind of putting his own view and distinction towards. And then the second one is the Augustinian one. And that one as well, he wants to go and to say his view is distinct from. And so the idea that the works done that are, empowered by God's grace, that those are justifying in some kinds of way. That's Calvin looks at it and says, I don't agree with that either. So anyway, I hope that's not too much inside baseball for you, but
well, I got to, the good thing about a podcast, I can re-listen and pause to think through everything you just said, because there was a lot to take in. But it's interesting too, like kind of the dynamic nature of interpretation on this, like as different people were looking at these texts, and even like the boldness and radical ideas of Calvin just going against Augustine, right? Like the dynamic nature of that is very fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think the goal, like you're saying, is like, how do we get to like as close to the source as possible?
Yeah.
Because if we can get to the source, like authorial intent, like what was actually meant and how it was perceived and understood by the churches, that's as close as we could possibly understand what Paul really meant.
Yeah.
Because the trouble that I get into too is like when we have our own kind of theological framework and whatever tradition we're part of, that kind of paints the picture and how I'm now reading that text versus like when you read the Bible critically, you're really trying to get to what was Paul actually saying here? Let me try to put this theological framework aside and just really look at that particular, what was being said by Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for me, you'll find in this book, I've done a lot of work in, not a lot of work. I haven't done a lot of work. I've built a lot on the work of Marcus Bockmuehl, who is he's the chair of scripture over in Oxford, and he does really, really good work in some of his books. So Seeing the Word is one of them, probably the easiest introduction to the kind of methodologically the kinds of stuff that he does. He's done a lot of really good work in showing how you can use early tradition as a historical guide and as a witness to the historical realities that are, that the texts go and, give witness to.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Dogado podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.